Introduction to The Silent Alpha's Mate. What if the one thing you've spent your life avoiding suddenly became the only thing that could save you? Selene had always been good at staying invisible. In a world ruled by alphas, dominance, and ancient shifter rivalries, blending in wasn't just preferable, it was necessary. Life as a healer on the outskirts of her village was simple, quiet, predictable, and that's exactly how she liked it. But fate, as it turns out, isn't particularly interested in what Selene wants. One moment, she was tending to herbs by the stream. The next, she was kneeling beneath the ancient oak, hands stained red as she pressed against the wounds of the most dangerous alpha in the region, Cassian Blackthorn, the silent alpha. Stories about Cassian whispered through the village like ghostly warnings. A ruthless leader, a shadow in the woods. His enemies feared him, his own pack barely understood him. But as Selene stared down at him, bleeding and barely conscious beneath the moonlight, all she saw was a man hanging by a thread, and something inside her, something she couldn't explain, refused to let him go. She should have walked away, but she didn't. Now, there's a mark at the curve of her neck, faint but unrelenting, a claim she never agreed to, and as much as she tells herself it means nothing, the bond tugging at the edges of her soul suggests otherwise. Cassian's enemies are circling. Wolves with sharp teeth and darker intentions. And Selene? She's standing in the middle of it all, an outsider who suddenly holds more power than she ever asked for. The question isn't whether she can survive in Cassian's world, it's whether Cassian's world can survive her. Because sometimes the quietest forces make the loudest impact. And Selene is about to prove that even the silent alpha isn't immune to the strength of someone who refuses to be forgotten. Chapter 1. Really Bad Day. The smell of rosemary and sage filled the apothecary, earthy and sharp, masking the faint bitterness of dried wolfsbane stored in glass jars along the wooden shelves. Selene stood behind the counter, grinding lavender into fine powder with slow, deliberate circles. The rhythmic motion was soothing, a quiet ritual in her otherwise predictable day. "Selene, did you hear?" A loud voice shattered the calm. Marla, the village baker, burst through the door, clutching a loaf of bread as if it were a vital piece of evidence. Selene barely glanced up. "If this is about the Henderson boy eating too many sweets again, I'm afraid my herbs can't cure poor judgment." Marla snorted. "No, not that. It's Cassian Blackthorn. Apparently he tore through the northern border last night. Some say he left a trail of bodies in his wake." Selene hummed non-committally, not bothering to lift her gaze from the mortar and pestle. "Alphas do have a flair for the dramatic." Marla's eyes narrowed, leaning closer. "You're too calm about this. Aren't you worried? He's the silent alpha, Selene. You know what they say about him. That he broods in corners and glowers people into submission?" Selene's lips twitched. "Sounds exhausting." Marla huffed, clearly unimpressed with Selene's lack of concern. "One of these days, your indifference is going to bite you. Probably literally." Selene only smiled, pouring the crushed lavender into a small linen pouch. She had long since learned that the affairs of alphas were best left untouched. Power struggles and dominance displays had no place in her quiet life of tending to scraped knees and broken bones. "Selene!" An elderly man shuffled inside, his face etched with lines of worry. "Good afternoon, Mr. Turner." Selene moved from behind the counter, already knowing the source of his concern. "Rheumatism acting up again?" He nodded stiffly, lowering himself onto a stool by the window. "The cold's been bitin' worse than a hungry wolf." Selene knelt beside him, her hands gentle as they hovered over his knee. Warmth pooled beneath her fingertips, a faint golden glow tracing along his skin for just a breath before fading. Mr. Turner exhaled, relief softening his features. "Every time you do that, I swear you take 10 years off my life." Selene smiled faintly, tucking her hair behind her ear. "I doubt that's how it works, but I'm glad it helps." A shadow crossed Marla's face as she watched from behind the counter. "You're lucky you weren't born in a pack, Selene. If people saw that—" "They'd say I'm good at my job," Selene interrupted, rising gracefully to her feet. "No one likes to limp around with swollen joints, Marla." Marla's lips pursed, as if biting back another comment. Selene didn't press. She preferred to keep her abilities discreet. Not because she feared judgment, but because attention often led to expectations. And expectations had a way of dragging people into the very things they wished to avoid. Mr. Turner patted her hand in thanks and shuffled out the door, leaving Selene to restock herbs in silence. The day passed in an unremarkable haze. Minor burns, cuts from reckless children, and gossip swirling like leaves in the wind. Every so often, Cassian's name emerged in passing conversations, but Selene treated it like distant thunder. Loud, but far away. Until the end of the day. Selene stepped outside the apothecary, locking the door behind her as twilight settled over the village. The air was crisp, carrying the mingling scents of pine and chimney smoke. Her path home led through the woods, the fading sunlight filtering through the trees like strands of gold thread. Halfway down the trail she paused. The distinct, coppery tang of blood pricked her senses. It was faint but unmistakable. Selene's brows knitted together, her hand instinctively brushing the small dagger strapped beneath her cloak. She told herself it was probably a deer, common enough this time of year, but something about the way the scent lingered made the hairs on her neck rise. She scanned the tree line, but the woods stared back in indifferent silence. Shaking off the unease, Selene pressed on, quickening her pace. She was halfway home when the faintest echo of howls drifted through the forest. The forest thrummed with its usual symphony, birds chirping, branches rustling, and the gentle babble of the stream curling around the village's edge. Selene followed the narrow path, a basket swinging from her arm as she gathered herbs for the apothecary. It was peaceful, too peaceful. Her steps slowed as she neared the water. The hum of the world around her felt off. The air carried a weight she couldn't place, like the charged stillness before a storm. She exhaled slowly, shaking off the unease. "Don't start imagining things," she muttered, kneeling at the stream's edge. As she pulled a bundle of mint from the soil, her gaze caught on the soft earth nearby. Large paw prints pressed deep into the mud, trailing along the bank and vanishing into the trees. "Strange," she whispered, brushing her fingers over the impressions. Wolves weren't rare in the surrounding forests, but these were big. Larger than any she'd seen. The spacing suggested a creature far heavier than the average wolf. Maybe Marla wasn't exaggerating after all, she mused, lips twitching into a smirk. Still, she dismissed it with a shake of her head. Overthinking was practically the village's favorite pastime, but she had herbs to collect and a bakery delivery to make. A few oversized paw prints weren't about to derail her day. As she worked, the prickling sensation of being watched lingered. She glanced over her shoulder once, twice. Each time, the trees stared back in silence, the underbrush swaying lazily. By the third glance, she scolded herself. "You're being ridiculous. Stop listening to Marla." Yet, as she made her way toward the village, the forest felt quieter. By midday, the market square bustled. Villagers bartered over produce, children weaved between carts, and gossip flowed as freely as tavern ale. Selene slipped into the bakery, hoping to avoid conversation. "Selene!" Marla's voice boomed from the back, shattering any illusion of subtlety. Selene winced. "I'm not here to chat." "Nonsense." Marla emerged, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "You live for my company, Admit it. I think you mistake toleration for enjoyment. Selene placed the basket on the counter, tilting her head as Marla pulled back the cloth to inspect the herbs. Bless you, girl. My knees will thank you. Marla leaned in, eyes narrowing. Now, did you hear? Selene arched a brow. If this is about Cassian Blackthorn again. It is about Cassian Blackthorn. Marla's grin widened. The Henderson boy saw wolves near the eastern ridge this morning. Not just any wolves. His wolves, Selene sighed, already regretting stepping foot inside. Marla, wolves live here. It's kind of their thing. Marla waved a hand. Not like these. They're his. They only move when he does. Selene bit the inside of her cheek. She hated to admit it, but Marla had a point. The paw prints, the heavy stillness in the air, none of it felt coincidental. Still, she refused to indulge Marla's excitement. Maybe they needed a change of scenery, Selene quipped, lifting the empty basket. Even wolves need a vacation. Marla narrowed her eyes. You choke, but when he shows up at your door, don't say I didn't warn you. Selene smirked. Alphas and I exist in different universes. We're not colliding anytime soon. Marla's cackle followed her out into the square. The sun dipped low as Selene started home, the sky streaked with orange and purple along the treetops. She took the same path she always did, but this time her senses stretched further. The heaviness from the stream hadn't lifted. If anything, it had thickened. Each step felt muffled, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Selene slowed near the clearing by the old oak. A flicker of movement tugged at the edge of her vision. Her head snapped toward the source, a shadow slipping between the trees. Her heart thudded. She stepped forward cautiously. Hello? The word barely left her lips before the shadow disappeared into the underbrush. Selene stayed rooted for several breaths, listening. Finally, she shook her head and resumed walking. Get a grip, Selene, you're just tired. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching. Chapter 2. Grasping at Straws. Selene twisted the lid onto a glass jar with more force than necessary, the sharp click echoing through the apothecary. The rest of the room was quiet, too quiet. She preferred it that way, or at least, that's what she told herself. The villagers had been more animated than usual today, their whispers trailing her wherever she went. Rogue Alpha, they murmured like a prayer or a curse, heads tilted toward the woods that bordered the village. Selene had tuned them out. Mostly. Selene, I swear to the gods you're one sigh away from blowing the roof off this place. Marla's voice jolted Selene from her thoughts. She stood at the counter, arms crossed and a single brow raised. I'm fine, Selene replied, brushing her hands down the front of her apron. Marla snorted. Sure you are. And I'm the queen of the forest. Selene grabbed the next bundle of dried herbs, tearing at the stems with unnecessary focus. I just like the quiet. No harm in that. There's quiet, Marla said, leaning on the counter. And then there's whatever this is. You look like you're trying to exorcise those poor plants. Selene's lips twitched, but she didn't glance up. Marla drummed her fingers on the wood. You can't ignore it forever, you know. People are talking. Cassian's name keeps coming up. Rumors about rogue wolves near the border. Selene met her gaze then, narrowing her eyes. Cassian Blackthorn's life has nothing to do with me. Marla gave a slow, knowing smile. Not yet. Selene rolled her eyes. Fine, be stubborn. Marla relented, snatching a small pouch of herbs off the counter. But when he darkens your doorstep, I'll expect a full apology in the form of fresh rosemary scones. I'll consider it, Selene muttered, watching Marla saunter out the door. The bell above the entrance chimed softly behind her, leaving Selene alone with the silence once more. The afternoon stretched long and uneventful, filled with the hum of mortar grinding herbs and the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Selene busied herself in the apothecary, hoping work would drown out the restlessness that tugged at the edges of her mind. It wasn't working. Every so often, she caught herself glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see something lurking just beyond the tree line. Ridiculous. She wasn't going to fall victim to the same paranoia infecting the rest of the village. Wolves existed, yes, but wolves stayed in the woods. They didn't come knocking. A sharp knock at the door snapped her out of her thoughts. She hesitated, smoothing her apron before crossing the room. "Come in," Selene called, pulling open the door. A young man stood there, pale and sweating, one hand pressed to his shoulder. His clothes were rumpled, and dirt smudged his face. "Liam!" Selene's eyes widened. "What happened to you?" I don't know," Liam stammered, wincing as he shifted his weight. Selene guided him inside quickly, directing him to sit on the nearest stool. The faint scent of blood wafted from his torn shirt. She knelt beside him, gently prying his hand away from his shoulder. The scratches were deep, too deep for an ordinary fall or scrape. The edges looked jagged, as if something with claws had raked across his skin. "Liam, this looks like—" Selene hesitated, unsure how much she wanted to voice aloud. "I thought it was a dog," Liam interrupted, as if reading her thoughts. "But it was bigger. Much bigger." Selene's gaze flicked toward the window instinctively. "Where did this happen?" she asked, reaching for a cloth to clean the wound. "By the river, near the old oak." Liam winced as the cloth met his skin. "It jumped out of nowhere. I didn't even see it coming." Selene's hands moved with practiced ease, but her mind raced. The old oak, near where she had seen the paw prints. "It's strange," Liam muttered. Selene glanced up, meeting his wide-eyed gaze. "What is—" Liam swallowed hard. It didn't feel like an attack. It just ran past me, almost like it was chasing something else. Selene frowned, tying off the bandage around his shoulder. "That's not exactly comforting, Liam." He gave a nervous laugh. "Yeah, well, I didn't stick around to ask questions." She couldn't blame him for that. And Selene rose, offering Liam a hand. "You'll be fine. Just keep the wound clean and rest for a few days." Liam nodded, but his expression remained tense as he lingered by the door. "You should be careful, Selene. Something's not right in the forest." She offered a soft smile, though the unease in her stomach twisted a little tighter. "Don't worry," she said. "I'm always careful." Night had settled by the time Selene locked the apothecary. The village bathed in the soft glow of lanterns. The path home stretched ahead, winding along the forest's edge. The cool air nipped at her skin as she walked, the usual nighttime sounds filling the space around her. But as she neared the stream, the world grew unnaturally still. Selene stopped, listening intently. Nothing. Not even the chirp of crickets. A chill prickled down her spine. And then, howls. Low and distant, but unmistakable. Selene's breath hitched, and for just a moment she thought she saw something shift among the trees. But when she looked again, there was only darkness. The wind tugged at Selene's cloak as she crossed the clearing by the ancient oak, the faint rustling of leaves the only sound beneath the heavy, cloud-streaked sky. The moon hovered low, casting silver ribbons through the branches, but the peacefulness felt like an illusion, thin, fragile, as if something hidden lurked just out of sight. Selene's boots crunched softly over fallen leaves, and she quickened her pace, telling herself she wasn't imagining things, she was lying. It wasn't just the howls the night before, or the strange paw prints by the stream. The forest had been breathing differently, slower, like it was holding its breath. And now, so was she. A metallic scent brushed the air, faint, but sharp enough to halt her steps. Selene froze, her heart thumping against her ribs. Blood. Her eyes swept the clearing, narrowing on a dark shape slumped against the gnarled roots of the ancient oak. She approached slowly, instinct and curiosity warring in her mind. The closer she got, the more she realized it wasn't an ordinary traveler or wounded animal. It was a man. His black shirt was shredded, soaked through with crimson that spread from his side. His dark hair hung over his face, damp with sweat, and his breathing was shallow, uneven. Despite the obvious injury, his body was imposing. Broad, muscled, a physicality that seemed out of place for someone so vulnerable. Selene crouched beside him, her fingers trembling as they hovered just above his shoulder. She hesitated, biting her lip. "Who are you?" she whispered, though she doubted he could answer. The man shifted slightly, a low, ragged growl rumbling from his throat. His head turned just enough for her to glimpse his face, sharp jawline, sun-bronzed skin, and a faint scar slicing through his left eyebrow. His brows furrowed in pain, but there was something else in his expression, defiance, even as his body betrayed him. Selene drew in a breath. Cassian Blackthorn. She should have walked away. Every instinct screamed at her to leave him there. He was dangerous. The stories alone were enough to confirm that. But beneath the hardened edges, he was bleeding, dying, and she couldn't ignore that. "Of course it's you," she muttered, tugging her satchel off her shoulder. Because a normal rogue bleeding out in the forest would have been too simple. Her hands worked quickly, pulling out clean strips of linen and a vial of crushed herbs. She pressed the cloth against his side, feeling the warm, slick blood seep through instantly. Cassian's body tensed under her touch, and his hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. Selene sucked in a breath but didn't flinch. "Easy. I'm trying to help, not finish the job." His fingers loosened slightly, though the golden flicker in his half-lidded eyes warned her that the wolf beneath his skin wasn't entirely dormant. "I'll have you patched up in no time," she said softly, grounding herself in the rhythm of her work. She smeared the herbal paste along his wound, murmuring under her breath. Her powers hummed faintly at her fingertips, the heat seeping into his skin as the worst of the bleeding slowed. Cassian exhaled, his chest rising and falling with more ease. Selene allowed herself a small sigh of relief. "You're lucky I found you." His lips twitched faintly, almost as if he'd heard her. She continued wrapping the wound, her brow furrowing as the golden glow beneath her fingertips flared unexpectedly. The faint pulse of it mirrored the erratic rhythm of his heartbeat, sinking to something primal and raw. Selene stilled, feeling an unexplainable pull, like a thread binding them together. Cassian's grip returned, gentler this time, as his fingers brushed over her hand. His skin was feverishly warm, but something else lingered, like static between them. Then, his head dipped forward, brushing against her neck in a gesture so intimate it left her breathless. His nose lingered along the curve of her throat, and before Selene could react, Cassian pressed closer, his breath ragged against her skin. The scent was subtle at first, earthy, warm, and undeniably wolf, but it deepened, coating her senses as if he'd left an imprint there. Her eyes widened. Selene pulled back slightly, staring down at him. "What? Did you just—" Cassian didn't respond. His head lolled to the side, unconscious once more, but the faint trace of his scent still lingered on her skin. Her pulse hammered. She knew what this was. "He marked me." Selene sat frozen, heart thudding against her ribs as she processed the weight of it. Marks weren't accidental. Even in his delirium, Cassian's wolf had acted on instinct, and now she was tethered to him, at least until he woke up and decided if it had been intentional, which, if she had to guess, it probably wasn't. Selene cursed softly, brushing hair from her face as she carefully laid him against the oak. "You're going to owe me for this," she muttered, securing the last of the bandages. She sat back on her heels, staring at the man beneath the moonlight. For someone so feared, he looked strangely peaceful now. Then his eyes opened. Golden and intense, they locked onto hers with a sharp clarity that sent a shiver down her spine. Selene swallowed. "You're welcome?" Cassian's gaze didn't waver. His lips parted slightly, but the words never came. Instead, he simply watched her, as if he already knew her. Chapter 3. Head in the Sand. Morning sunlight streamed through the apothecary's small window, casting golden slants across the worn wooden floor. Selene stood behind the counter, slicing through bundles of rosemary with more force than necessary. Her hands worked, but her mind drifted. It drifted to him. Or rather, the distinct absence of him. Cassian was gone. At dawn, she had returned to the ancient oak, only to find faint imprints in the grass where he had lain. A few scattered leaves darkened where he bled. No struggle, no lingering scent. It was as if the entire encounter had unraveled with the night, leaving only the memory behind. But it hadn't. Her fingers drifted to her neck, brushing the spot where his breath had lingered. No visible mark remained, but the sensation of him clung to her skin like a ghost. "Thinking about me?" Selene startled, nearly nicking her finger. She spun around to find Marla lounging against the doorframe, arms folded, a smirk tugging at her lips. "You almost gave me a heart attack." Selene pressed a hand to her chest. Marla laughed, entirely unrepentant. "You've been twitchy all morning. Something happen?" "No." The answer came too quickly. Selene cleared her throat, softening her tone. "Just a restless night." Marla's eyes narrowed. "Restless, huh? Sounds suspicious. Was it a someone?" Selene rolled her eyes and turned back to the herbs, willing her hands to stay steady. "Not everything is about men, Marla." "Sure, but if you're going to lie, at least make it interesting." Marla crossed the room, hopping onto the counter. "Come on, spill. Did one of the Henderson boys finally ask you to the festival?" Selene shot her a flat look. "I'd sooner kiss a toad." Marla grinned. "I can make that happen." Selene opened her mouth to retort, but something tugged at her sensitive fingertips, the faintest ripple beneath her skin, like the distant brush of fingertips. Her head snapped toward the window, eyes scanning the trees. Nothing. "Selene?" She blinked, shaking off the sensation. "Sorry, what were you saying?" Marla frowned. "You sure you're all right? You look like you saw a ghost." "I'm fine." Selene forced a smile, but her pulse betrayed her. Liar. By afternoon, Selene convinced herself she had imagined everything. Too much time alone in the woods. That's what she told herself. An overactive imagination fueled by Marla's endless gossip. But the bond hummed beneath her skin. It wasn't constant, just a flicker at the edge of her awareness, like someone gently pulling on a thread she couldn't sever. Selene buried herself in tasks to drown it out. She restocked shelves, scrubbed counters, reorganized jars that didn't need reorganizing. None of it worked. By late afternoon, she stood by the stream, watching the water swirl around smooth stones, trying to force her thoughts into silence. "Get out of my head," she thought, though she wasn't sure if the plea was for Cassian or herself. "You called me here." Selene stumbled back, her breath catching. The voice wasn't spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. His words brushed against her mind, low and familiar, as if whispered from the shadows. Her gaze darted to the tree line, half expecting him to emerge, but the forest remained still. "I'm losing it," she muttered, rubbing her temples. "Fantastic." By dusk, the village square flickered to life with lanterns and laughter. Children chased each other between market stalls, and the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoed faintly from across the way. Normal. Selene focused on the warmth of the lanterns, the scent of baking bread, and the weight of her satchel against her hip. But the closer she drew to the apothecary, the more the hum beneath her skin stirred. Her steps slowed. A shadow loomed at the edge of the trees, broad-shouldered, still, unmistakable even at a distance. Cassian. He didn't move, just stood there, watching, arms loose at his sides as if he had all the time in the world. Selene's heart lurched, thudding hard against her ribs. "Staring isn't polite," she called, folding her arms. A faint smile tugged at his lips. "Neither is ignoring someone after they save your life." Selene threw her hands up. "You disappeared. I thought you left." "I did." His voice lowered, curling through the space between them. "But that doesn't mean I stayed gone." The thread between them tugged, subtle but undeniable. Selene took a step closer, narrowing her eyes. "Why are you here?" Cassian leaned against a nearby tree, his golden eyes catching the moonlight. "Maybe I wanted to see if you'd keep pretending I didn't exist." Her cheeks warmed. She immediately regretted every internal rant from earlier. Groaning under her breath, Selene muttered, "You're impossible." Cassian's chuckle was low and rough, like someone who hadn't done it in a while. Selene hesitated, then sighed. "If you're going to haunt the tree line, at least come in and buy something. Make yourself useful." Cassian stepped forward, the light brushing across sharp features as he approached. "I'll keep that in mind," he said softly. As he neared, Selene felt the bond hum brighter, tightening like a thread wound too close to snapping. And judging by the look in his eyes, he felt it too. This is going to be trouble, she thought grimly, trouble with golden eyes and a smirk she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to resist. Selene knelt in the garden behind the apothecary, pulling weeds with the precision of someone trying to distract herself. The dirt under her nails grounded her, a small comfort in the swirl of chaos that Cassian Blackthorn had brought with him. She shouldn't have let him stay, but when he'd shown up at her doorstep that morning, leaning casually against the frame like he wasn't the most feared alpha in the region, her ability to say no had evaporated. Now, as the late afternoon sun dipped behind the trees, she could still feel him nearby. Lingering. "Are you going to stand there all day, or are you planning on helping?" she called without looking up. A soft chuckle drifted over her shoulder. Cassian rounded the corner, his arms crossed as he leaned against the low stone wall that framed her garden. "I didn't want to interrupt." His golden eyes glinted with amusement. Selene sighed and brushed a strand of hair from her face, meeting his gaze with a flat look. "Oh, you're considerate now." "I can be," Cassian replied, pushing off the wall, "when it suits me." He crouched beside her, his presence far too close for comfort. The heat radiating off him made her acutely aware of just how small the space between them had become. Selene pretended to focus on the weeds. "I assume you didn't come here just to supervise my gardening." Cassian tilted his head, studying her like she was one of the herbs he couldn't quite identify. "I need a place to stay, somewhere quiet." Her hands froze mid-pull. "You're joking." "I'm not." Selene exhaled slowly, closing her eyes for half a beat. "Cassian, you can't stay here. You know that, right? The village—" "Won't even notice," he interrupted, his tone light but firm. "I can stay out of sight." "You? The infamous silent alpha? Out of sight?" She raised a brow. "Your eyes glow in the dark, Cassian. You're not exactly subtle." Cassian smirked. "I can be subtle when it matters." Selene narrowed her gaze at him, searching for the catch. There had to be one. "And if I say no?" she asked carefully. Cassian leaned in just enough to blur the edges of her personal space, his voice dropping lower. "Then I'll stay in the woods. But the wolves won't be far behind." Her stomach twisted at the unspoken meaning behind his words. She'd already noticed shadows moving in the tree line the past 2 nights. His enemies were closer than either of them cared to admit. Selene sighed, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "Fine. Temporary. You stay at the outskirts. No wandering into town, no unnecessary lingering. Got it? Cassian's lips tugged into that infuriating half-smile again. Got it. By the time evening settled over the village, Selene regretted every decision she'd made that day. Marla had stopped by earlier, suspiciously eyeing Cassian who, in typical fashion, had leaned in the doorway like he owned the place. Selene had distracted her with pastries, but even Marla's skepticism had its limits. Now, Selene sat by the apothecary window, watching Cassian from afar. He was near the edge of the garden, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate movements. The blade caught the moonlight, reflecting it like a signal beacon she swore he was doing on purpose. "You're not very good at the whole staying unnoticed thing," Selene called through the open window. Cassian glanced up, the knife stilling in his hands. "I like to keep my enemies guessing." Selene snorted softly. "So you do have enemies lurking around here." His expression darkened for a flicker of a moment, the playful glint in his eyes fading. "I've been watching." Selene's heart skipped, though she tried not to show it. "Great. That's exactly what I wanted. More strangers loitering around my shop." Cassian set the knife down and stood, crossing the small garden until he was beneath the window. His gaze softened, though there was still an edge to it. "You didn't have to let me stay," he said quietly. Selene met his eyes, the faint pull of their bond pressing at the edges of her awareness. "I didn't do it for you." Cassian's lips curved just slightly. "You keep telling yourself that." She rolled her eyes, but there was no real annoyance behind it. Later that night, as Selene bolted the apothecary's door, she couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease curling in her chest. Cassian was still outside, a shadow at the village border. He was keeping watch. She could feel it. The bond tugged gently, that strange thread connecting them growing tighter the longer he stayed near. Selene tried to push it aside, telling herself it was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. Cassian would leave, and things would go back to normal. But as the faint sound of rustling drifted from the woods, and a pair of golden eyes flickered beyond the tree line, she wasn't so sure anymore. Cassian's voice echoed in her mind, unbidden. "You're in danger, Selene, because I'm here." And for the first time, she wondered if letting him stay had been a mistake. Chapter 4. Enemies and Allies. Selene's apothecary smelled faintly of pine and herbs, the crisp morning air wafting in through the open window. She lined jars along the shelves, pretending her heart wasn't thudding in her chest. It had been 2 days since Cassian had casually inserted himself into her life, and the village hadn't burned down yet. Small victories. The door creaked open, but the footsteps were too heavy to belong to one of her usual customers. Selene glanced up, brow furrowing, at the broad figure standing just inside the doorway. He was tall, taller than Cassian by a hair, and his dark eyes scanned the apothecary with a sharpness that felt far too predatory for her liking. "You must be Selene," the man said, his voice smooth but edged with something hard to place. Selene's fingers tightened around the jar she was holding. "And you are?" "Elias," he replied, stepping closer. His gaze flickered to the herbs on the counter, then back to her with calculated interest. "Cassian's beta." "Of course." Selene set the jar down and crossed her arms. "Well, if you're here to check on him, you're too late. He left for the woods an hour ago." Elias tilted his head, studying her. "I'm not here for Cassian. I'm here for you." Selene's pulse jumped, but she kept her expression neutral. "I wasn't aware I required an audience." Elias's mouth curved into something resembling a smirk, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Cassian isn't known for trusting easily. If he's chosen to stay near you, I need to know why." Selene met his gaze steadily. "I saved his life, that's all. He needed somewhere to heal, and I happened to be nearby." "Convenient," Elias murmured, but there was no accusation in his tone, just curiosity. Selene shrugged, moving behind the counter to put some space between them. I didn't exactly invite him with open arms. Elias's eyes narrowed slightly, as if assessing whether or not she was lying. Before he could reply, the door swung open again, and a young shifter with wild dark hair and a crooked grin poked his head inside. Elias, stop intimidating the poor girl. Elias glanced over his shoulder, unamused. I wasn't intimidating her. Right, the younger man drawled, flashing Selene a boyish grin. I'm Felix, by the way, Cassian's third in command, and this charming block of stone is Elias, but you've met. Selene arched a brow. Charming isn't the word I'd use. Felix laughed, leaning casually against the counter. Don't let him scare you. He's like that with everyone. Elias crossed his arms but didn't argue. Selene eyed the pair of them, feeling oddly like she'd stepped into the middle of some family squabble. Were all shifters this strange? Why are you two here, really? She asked finally. Felix's grin faded slightly, and he exchanged a look with Elias. Cassian's presence has drawn attention, Elias admitted, his voice quieter now. Some of the rival packs are circling. Selene's stomach tightened. Fantastic. That's exactly what I needed. More wolves sniffing around my shop. Felix chuckled. Don't worry, most of them wouldn't dare approach the village. Before Selene could respond, the air shifted, something primal brushing against the edges of her senses. The door creaked open once more, but this time the figure that stepped inside was different. His scent hit her first, sharp, wild, and unfamiliar. His eyes, pale and cold, swept over the room with a laziness that felt intentional. Felix stiffened, stepping away from the counter. Can I help you? Selene asked carefully, aware of how still Elias had become. The stranger's gaze lingered on her. I'm looking for someone, Cassian Blackthorn. Selene's pulse quickened, but she kept her face carefully blank. You won't find him here. The stranger's mouth curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. That's so. Elias shifted slightly, putting himself between Selene and the stranger. She said he's not here. Move along. The rival shifter's gaze flickered toward Elias, a faint challenge dancing behind his eyes. Selene could feel the tension crackling between them, like the air before a storm. Before anything could escalate, a new presence filled the doorway. Cassian. He didn't say a word as he stepped inside, his golden gaze locking onto the stranger with predatory calm. I believe she said I wasn't here, Cassian drawled, his voice soft but dangerous. The rival shifter's smirk faded, and his eyes narrowed slightly. You can't hide forever, Blackthorn. Cassian stepped further into the room, his posture relaxed but unyielding. I don't hide. And you're standing in the middle of my mate's shop. Selene's breath caught, but she didn't dare look at Cassian. The rival shifter's eyes flickered to her, something dark twisting in his expression. After a long pause, he gave a shallow nod and turned to leave. The tension in the room didn't ease until the door clicked shut behind him. Selene exhaled slowly, glaring at Cassian. Mate. Cassian glanced at her, one brow lifting in mild amusement. Would you rather I let him tear the shop apart looking for me? Alex snickered from the corner. I like her. She doesn't fall for your nonsense. Cassian's lips quirked. She'll learn. Selene groaned, rubbing her temples. I don't suppose pretending this never happened is an option? Cassian's eyes gleamed. Not a chance. Selene tugged at the edges of her cloak, glaring daggers at Cassian's back as they walked deeper into the forest. Let me get this straight, she said, quickening her steps to keep pace with his long strides. You're dragging me to some secret wolf gathering without warning and expect me to just smile and nod? Cassian's lips twitched, but he didn't slow down. You don't have to smile. I'd settle for not glaring at everyone. I am not glaring. Cassian glanced sideways at her. Your eyes are shooting daggers as we speak, Selene scoffed. I was born with dagger eyes. His chuckle was low and rumbling, but he said nothing more. She hated how easily he brushed things off. Cassian had appeared at her door that morning, smug as ever, with the casual announcement that they'd be attending a gathering of his clan. No explanation, no room for argument, just a cryptic, "You'll want to look presentable," before hauling her along like she was some stray cat he'd decided to keep. The worst part? She'd agreed. Why? Oh, right, because saying no to Cassian was like arguing with a thunderstorm. "Where are we going exactly?" Selene asked, ducking under a low-hanging branch. "To a clearing just past the ridge," Cassian replied. "It's neutral ground. No one will start trouble there." Selene snorted. "That's reassuring." "It should be," he said with a teasing glance. "I'm not letting anyone lay a hand on you." She tried not to read too much into that. By the time they reached the clearing, Selene was already regretting every decision that led her here. The space was crowded with shifters, some leaning against trees while others mingled in tight circles. Their gazes shifted the moment Cassian appeared, eyes narrowing in curiosity and, in some cases, suspicion. Selene swallowed hard. Fantastic. As if sensing her unease, Cassian's hand brushed against the small of her back, guiding her forward. "Relax," he murmured near her ear. "They won't bite." "You bite," she hissed under her breath. Cassian's grin widened. "Only when asked nicely." Selene elbowed him in the ribs, but his laughter only deepened. Several sets of eyes followed them as they wove through the crowd, and Selene did her best to keep her posture steady. She wasn't about to let them see how out of place she felt. A tall, dark-haired woman approached, her piercing gaze raking over Selene with thinly veiled interest. "Is this her?" the woman asked, directing the question at Cassian as if Selene weren't standing right there. Cassian nodded. "Selene." The woman's brows lifted slightly. "She's different." Selene's lips twitched. "I get that a lot." Cassian's beta Elias appeared at his side, arms crossed as he assessed the growing tension. "Don't mind her, Selene," Elias said. "Lean enjoys testing new faces." Selene arched a brow. "Testing, huh? Should I be worried?" Lena grinned, but there was something sharp in the expression. "Only if you can't keep up." Cassian's arm brushed against Selene's as he leaned closer, his voice dropping just for her. Ignore her. She's all bark." "Right," Selene muttered, "because that's comforting." The night wore on, and Selene found herself drifting to the edge of the gathering, relieved to put some distance between herself and the pack politics she didn't understand. Cassian was across the clearing, speaking with a group of elders. His golden eyes occasionally flicked in her direction, as if making sure she hadn't disappeared. She wouldn't, of course, but part of her wondered if slipping away would be easier than dealing with the simmering tension she felt from certain shifters. Pretty thing to be standing alone out here. Selene stiffened at the unfamiliar voice behind her. A tall shifter with pale hair and an unsettling smirk approached, his eyes gleaming faintly under the moonlight. "Cassian's been keeping you close," the man said, circling her slowly. "Strange. He's never been the mate type." Selene's jaw clenched. "And you are?" "Darius," he replied smoothly. "I run with the Eastern Pack." "Congratulations," Selene deadpanned. Darius chuckled. "You've got spirit. I like that." Before Selene could respond, Cassian's voice cut through the air like steel. "I'd step back if I were you." Darius's eyes flickered toward Cassian, but his smirk didn't waver. "I was just saying hello," Darius said with mock innocence. Cassian's gaze darkened, and he crossed the space between them in seconds, his posture radiating quiet threat. "Hello's over," Cassian growled. Darius held his hands up in mock surrender, but didn't back down completely. "She's not marked, Blackthorn," Darius said casually. which means she's fair game." Selene's breath caught, and she opened her mouth to argue, but Cassian stepped between them. "She's mine," Cassian said, his voice a low rumble. The possessiveness in his tone sent a shiver down Selene's spine, and she hated that it didn't entirely bother her. Darius's smirk faltered, and after a tense beat, he stepped back. "Fine," Darius drawled, "but don't expect everyone to roll over so easily." He disappeared into the crowd, leaving Selene to stare at Cassian. "Yours?" she asked, arching a brow. Cassian's gaze softened as he turned toward her, but there was no apology in his eyes. "It shut him up, didn't it?" Selene groaned, rubbing her temples. "I need a drink." Cassian grinned. "I'll get you one." Chapter 5. Earning Respect. The clearing behind the apothecary smelled faintly of smoke and pine, the remnants of Cassian's pack lingering like ghosts beneath the moonlight. Selene stood with her sleeves rolled to her elbows, carefully inspecting the gash running along the side of Elias's ribs. "You're not going to like this," she warned, dabbing a cloth soaked in an herbal tincture against the wound. Elias hissed, gripping the edge of the table he sat on. "I don't like it already." "Good," Selene said flatly. "It means I'm doing it right." Cassian stood a few feet away, arms crossed and golden eyes narrowed, watching every flick of her wrist as though she might accidentally dismember his beta. "Relax," Selene called over her shoulder without looking up. "I've done this before. He's not going to lose a lung." Elias snorted. "That's a real confidence booster, thank you." Selene smirked, pressing a little harder just to make her point. Cassian stepped closer, his presence like a weight settling over the space. "He was careless. I told you not to engage with Darius's men." Elias winced, though it wasn't from Selene's ministrations this time. "I didn't engage with them. I was trying to keep Felix from getting his nose broken." "Again." Selene glanced between them, noting the tension in Cassian's jaw. "Felix seems like the type to deserve it," she muttered under her breath. Elias chuckled softly, but Cassian didn't so much as blink. When Selene finally pulled back, satisfied that the bleeding had stopped, she began wrapping the wound with clean linen. Her fingers moved deftly, her touch gentle, despite her teasing. "You know," Elias said, tilting his head toward Cassian, "for someone who claims to be uninterested in pack politics, you're getting real comfortable playing healer to the Silent Alpha's crew." Selene tightened the bandage just enough to make him hiss again. "I heal everyone, whether they deserve it or not." Cassian's gaze softened, barely, but Selene noticed. She pretended not to. Elias's lips twitched. "Cassian's lucky. Not many would patch up his men without demanding something in return." Selene arched a brow, standing and wiping her hands on a cloth. "Oh, trust me, I'm keeping a tab. I fully expect payment in the form of rare herbs or pastries. Felix owes me a lot of pastries." Cassian's lips quirked into something close to a smile. "I'll make sure he delivers." Before Selene could respond, the sound of crunching leaves drew her attention to the edge of the clearing. A group of wolves shifted in the shadows, their eyes gleaming faintly in the dark. At the front stood a tall figure, his posture relaxed but commanding, the rival alpha, Darius. Selene tensed, instinctively stepping back. Cassian moved almost imperceptibly, placing himself between her and Darius. "Relax," Cassian murmured, sensing her unease. "He's not here to fight." Darius's gaze flicked to Selene, and for a moment something unreadable crossed his face. "I see your healer's grown bold," Darius drawled, his voice calm but edged with something sharp. "Not many outsiders would stand so close to you." Cassian's stance didn't shift. "She's under my protection." Selene resisted the urge to roll her eyes. "So much for subtlety." Darius tilted his head, clearly amused. "I can see that." But you know this won't last forever, Blackthorn. You can't hide behind your healer forever. Cassian's eyes darkened, a low growl vibrating from his chest. I'm not hiding, he said, his voice dangerously soft. And she's not just a healer. Selene's breath caught, but she kept her gaze fixed on Darius, refusing to look at Cassian. Darius regarded them both for a long moment, then smirked. I'll be seeing you soon. With that, he turned, disappearing into the woods with his pack trailing behind him. Selene exhaled slowly once they were gone. You could have not painted a giant target on my back, she muttered, brushing dirt off her hands. Cassian watched the space where Darius had vanished, his expression unreadable. You weren't exactly invisible before. Selene shot him a glare. That's not comforting. Ah. Elias grinned, testing the flexibility of his arm now that the bandage was secure. Relax, Selene. It's a compliment. Selene arched a brow at him. Getting dragged into pack feuds doesn't feel like much of a compliment. Cassian finally looked at her then, his gaze lingering just a little longer than necessary. You're part of this now, he said simply. They'll know better than to test you again. Selene's heart skipped, but she forced herself to keep her expression neutral. Part of this? The words settled uncomfortably, and yet she didn't hate the sound of it. Not entirely. The village felt different that morning, too quiet. Even the usual chorus of birds seemed hesitant to break the heavy silence blanketing the woods. Selene stood outside the apothecary, arms crossed, watching the tree line with unease prickling at her skin. Cassian's pack had been unusually restless all week. Felix and Elias had doubled patrols, while Cassian himself had grown more guarded, though he wouldn't say why. Selene hated that, secrets hanging in the air like unspoken warnings. You're brooding again. Selene startled, glancing over her shoulder to find Felix grinning at her from the doorway. His hands rested casually on the frame, but his eyes, normally filled with mischief, held a flicker of concern. I don't brood, Selene replied flatly. You absolutely brood, Felix shot back. Cassian broods, you brood. At this rate, the whole pack's going to have permanent frown lines. Selene smirked. Sounds like a personal problem. Felix laughed but didn't leave his spot. Seriously, though, you feel it, don't you? Selene's smile faded as she turned back toward the woods. I do. Before Felix could reply, the faint rustle of leaves in the distance caught their attention. Elias emerged from the trees, his expression grim as he approached. Cassian wants everyone inside the borders, Elias announced, his gaze flickering towards Selene. Trouble's coming. Selene frowned. What kind of trouble? Elias didn't answer immediately. His sharp eyes scanned the tree line behind him, muscles tense like he expected something, or someone, to follow. Rival pack, he finally muttered. Darius's men are moving closer to the village. Cassian thinks they're testing boundaries. Felix's easygoing demeanor shifted, his playful grin fading. Testing boundaries, or looking for something? Elias's gaze hardened. Maybe both. Selene felt the unspoken weight behind those words. Looking for someone. By midday, the tension had thickened to the point that even the villagers noticed. Selene tried to distract herself with work, grinding herbs and reorganizing shelves, but the sense of being watched lingered. Cassian had been absent most of the day, no doubt coordinating defenses with Elias and the others. That left Selene pacing the apothecary like a restless animal in a cage. The bell above the door chimed, but the heavy footsteps that followed were too deliberate, too sharp to belong to a villager. Selene's hand instinctively drifted toward the dagger beneath her apron. A stranger stood in the doorway. Broad-shouldered, with a jagged scar running down the length of his jaw. His cold eyes locked onto her the moment he stepped inside. I'm looking for Cassian, the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Selene's grip tightened on the dagger. He's not here. The stranger took another step forward, his gaze sweeping the room like he was searching for hidden passages. Funny, he mused. Word is he's been spending a lot of time around here. Selene forced a calm expression, though every nerve screamed at her to stay on guard. Word travels fast, she replied, her tone clipped. But you've wasted a trip. Cassian isn't fond of surprise visitors. The man's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. I'm not here for pleasantries. His eyes narrowed. I'm here for you. Selene's pulse jumped. Before she could respond, the stranger lunged. Selene barely had time to pull the dagger free, blocking his advance as the blade scraped against the edge of his arm. He twisted sharply, knocking over shelves as Selene darted toward the back of the shop, heart racing. You've got some fight in you, the man growled, circling toward her with predatory ease. I get that a lot, Selene shot back, trying to keep distance between them. Her fingers brushed against a glass jar of wolfsbane, and she flung it at him without hesitation. The jar shattered against his shoulder, the sharp sting causing him to recoil. But not for long. Selene tried to dart for the door, but the man's hand closed around her arm, dragging her back with surprising force. She twisted, driving the hilt of the dagger against his ribs. The man snarled, but didn't let go. You're more trouble than you're worth, he hissed. Before he could land another blow, the front door crashed open. Cassian's growl filled the room, raw and dangerous. His eyes, bright and golden, locked onto the intruder. The stranger barely had time to react before Cassian crossed the space in a blur, slamming him against the wall with enough force to shake the shelves. Selene stumbled back, hand pressed to her ribs as Cassian pinned the rival shifter in place. You're making a habit of attacking what's mine, Cassian growled, his voice low but razor-sharp. The man coughed, struggling under Cassian's grip. I didn't know you'd claimed her, he rasped. Cassian's eyes flicked briefly toward Selene, unreadable. You know now. With one swift motion, Cassian released him, and the man collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Tell Darius if he wants something, Cassian said coldly. He can come himself, but if he touches her, Cassian's voice dipped to a lethal whisper, he won't walk away next time. The rival shifter staggered to his feet, casting Selene one final glance before stumbling out the door. Silence hung between them for several long moments, the tension thick enough to choke. Finally, Selene exhaled, brushing her hair from her face. I had it under control. Cassian's gaze softened slightly, though his eyes still held the remnants of his anger. You're bleeding. Selene glanced down, realizing a thin line of red traced her side where the man had scratched her. It's nothing, she waved him off. I've dealt with worse. Cassian didn't look convinced. You're not just some healer, Selene, he said quietly, stepping closer. You're part of this now, whether you like it or not. Selene met his gaze, the bond between them humming faintly beneath her skin. I didn't ask to be part of anything, she murmured. Cassian's eyes softened further, and for once there was no teasing in his expression. You didn't have to. Chapter 6. Selene woke with a sheen of sweat clinging to her skin. The thin sheet tangled around her legs like vines she couldn't shake. She groaned softly, pressing the heel of her hand to her forehead. Too hot. Her room was dim, the pale gray light of dawn seeping through the cracks in the shutters. Outside, the village stirred slowly, the faint sound of carts rolling over cobblestone and the chatter of early risers drifting through the air, but none of it felt real, like she was watching from behind glass. Selene sat up slowly, tugging the blanket away and swinging her legs over the side of the bed. Her head spun, nausea creeping up the back of her throat. Great, she muttered. I'm catching something, because that's exactly what I need right now. The apothecary was empty when she shuffled downstairs, but even the faint scent of herbs made her stomach twist. She grabbed a small vial of tonic from the shelf, swirling the amber liquid inside. Before she could take a sip, the door creaked open. Cassian filled the doorway, broad-shouldered and as effortlessly imposing as ever. His golden eyes swept over her in an instant, narrowing. "You look terrible." "Good morning to you too," Selene replied dryly, holding the vial to her lips. Before she could drink, Cassian crossed the room and gently took it from her hand. "It's not going to help," he said, examining the vial before setting it aside. Selene scowled. "I'm fine, it's just a fever." Cassian's gaze didn't waver. "It's not just a fever." There was something about the way he said it, too certain, too calm, like he already knew. Selene frowned, arms crossing over her chest. "Okay, what's going on?" Cassian hesitated for half a breath, his eyes flickering to the mark on her neck, the one that hadn't faded since the night he'd brushed against her skin beneath the ancient oak. "You're reacting to the mark," he said finally, voice low. Selene's brows drew together. "That doesn't make sense. It's not like we—" She waved her hand vaguely between them. "Completed anything." Cassian's lips twitched faintly. "It doesn't need to be completed to affect you. The bond's already started. And since it's unfinished, it can cause complications." Selene stared at him. "Complications," she repeated, as if saying it aloud would somehow make it more reasonable. Cassian leaned against the counter, arms crossing in front of him. "It'll get worse if we ignore it." A dry laugh escaped her lips. "That's comforting. And what exactly is the solution, Cassian? Let me guess. More bonding?" Cassian held her gaze, but there was a flicker of something else beneath the surface. He didn't answer. Selene groaned, pressing her fingers to her temples. "Unbelievable. I can't believe I'm being sidelined by magical wolf fever." "You're not being sidelined. Feels like I am." Cassian shifted, stepping closer until his hand lightly brushed her arm. The contact was brief, but warm. Too warm. Selene swallowed hard, pulling away and forcing a shaky smile. "I'll survive. Just let me handle this my way." Before Cassian could argue, the apothecary door creaked open once again. This time it wasn't Felix or Elias. A wiry man with sharp, predatory eyes stepped inside, his expression unreadable. Cassian stiffened immediately, placing himself slightly in front of Selene. "Bran," Cassian greeted, his tone cold. Bran's eyes flicked between the two of them, lingering a moment too long on Selene. "Darius sends his regards," Bran said smoothly, his voice like oil sliding over glass. Cassian's shoulders tensed. "Get to the point." Bran's smirk grew. "Darius wants her gone, out of the village, by the next full moon. If she stays, the village will suffer." Selene's stomach twisted painfully, but she masked it with a raised brow. "Wow," she said, stepping around Cassian before he could stop her. "I'd say I'm flattered by all the attention, but that might be pushing it." Bran's eyes gleamed with something dark. "You're not what we expected, but the orders stand." Cassian's growl rumbled low, vibrating through the space between them. "Tell Darius I don't take orders, and neither does she." Bran's gaze flickered to Cassian's hand, hovering a little too protectively near Selene's. "She's not Pack," Bran said softly, but the weight behind the words pressed down hard. "She's under my protection," Cassian replied, voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Bran's smirk never faded, but after a moment, he gave a shallow nod and slipped out the door without another word. The second he was gone, Selene released the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Well," she said lightly, hoping to ease the tightness in her chest, "that wasn't unsettling at all." Cassian didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned toward the window, his jaw tightening as he watched Bran disappear into the tree line. "You should leave," he said quietly. Selene blinked. "Excuse me?" Cassian finally looked at her, the weight of his gaze settling over her like a heavy cloak. "It's not safe here for you. Not anymore." Selene's eyes narrowed. "So that's it? I'm supposed to pack up and leave, just because Darius wants me gone?" "It's not just about Darius," Cassian snapped, his usual calm fracturing for the briefest moment. "The bond is making you a target. They won't stop until they get what they want." Selene stared at him, the gravity of his words sinking in slowly. But before she could respond, movement outside caught her attention. Cassian's voice drifted from the other room, low and sharp as he spoke to Elias. "She's getting worse," Cassian muttered. "If this keeps up, you know what needs to happen," Elias replied softly. Selene's breath caught, and she took a step back from the doorframe, heart hammering. "This is bigger than me," she realized. And for the first time, she wasn't sure running away would be enough. The door to Cassian's war room wasn't locked. Selene lingered in the dim hallway for a moment longer than necessary, hand resting lightly on the iron handle. Her better judgment told her to walk away, to leave the secrets Cassian kept buried right where they belonged. But curiosity had never been her strong suit. With a soft exhale, she pushed the door open. The room smelled faintly of pine and something darker, like old steel and forgotten battles. Moonlight streamed through a narrow window, casting silver light over the large wooden table at the center. Maps lay scattered across its surface, edges curling at the corners, marked by inked lines and jagged symbols she didn't recognize. Selene stepped closer, fingertips brushing the edge of one map. Red circles encased various points along the borders of Castian's territory, each one accompanied by hastily scrawled notes. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate. Darius, North Ridge, full moon approach. Her stomach twisted. Darius's name appeared over and over, threading through every inch of Cassian's carefully drawn plans. She had known the rival Alpha was a threat. Cassian wasn't exactly subtle when it came to growling at his enemies. But this felt different. This wasn't just territorial skirmishes or old grudges. This was war. "What are you doing in here?" Selene froze. Cassian's voice was calm, but the tension beneath it was unmistakable. Slowly she turned to find him leaning against the doorway, arms crossed over his chest. His golden eyes flickered in the low light, unreadable. "I was looking for answers," Selene replied, lifting her chin, "and you weren't exactly forthcoming." Cassian pushed off the doorframe, striding toward the table. His gaze swept over the maps, then settled on her. "There are things you don't need to know." Selene narrowed her eyes. "Don't patronize me, Cassian. I'm not some fragile human you can shield from the big bad wolves." His lips twitched faintly, though the humor didn't quite reach his eyes. "I wasn't trying to patronize you," he said softly. "I was trying to protect you." Selene crossed her arms, the weight of his gaze pressing down like an unspoken challenge. "From what?" she asked. "Darius? His pack? You think keeping me in the dark is going to stop them from coming after me?" Cassian exhaled slowly, raking a hand through his dark hair. "Darius isn't after me." His eyes met hers, steady and unrelenting. "He's after you." Selene's breath caught. "What?" Cassian leaned over the table, tracing his finger along the edge of one map. "Darius knows about your abilities, your healing," Cassian explained, his voice lower now. "He thinks having you will give him an advantage." Selene's throat tightened. Of course Darius knew. Word spread quickly in shifter circles, and Selene's refusal to stay hidden had likely drawn more attention than she'd realized. "So what?" she said after a long pause. "You think if I leave he'll just forget about me?" Cassian's gaze darkened. "No," he admitted, "but it'll make you harder to find." Selene shook her head, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "I'm not running, Cassian. I'm not asking you to run." His voice was soft, but there was a weight to it that pulled at something in her chest. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Cassian straightened, his expression shifting into something harder, less hesitant. "There's something else," he said carefully. Selene arched a brow. "That's not ominous at all." Cassian hesitated, his eyes flickering to the mark on her neck, the mark he'd left without realizing it. "The bond," he said quietly. "It's not normal. Not yet." Selene's stomach twisted. "And by not normal, you mean—" Cassian exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's incomplete. It can't be broken, Selene. Not without consequences." Her pulse quickened. "What kind of consequences?" Cassian's gaze met hers, and for the first time, she saw the faintest trace of uncertainty there. "Death," he admitted. "Or acceptance." Selene blinked. "Those are my only options?" Cassian nodded. Silence stretched between them, heavy and unrelenting. Selene finally sat down, resting her elbows on the edge of the table. She stared at the maps, tracing the circles with her finger. "Let me guess," she muttered. "You thought not telling me would somehow make this easier." Cassian sat across from her, his golden eyes watching her carefully. "I thought you deserved a choice," he said softly. Selene's lips twitched, though there was no humor behind it. "Well," she said after a long pause, "if dying isn't on the agenda today, I guess that leaves one option." Cassian arched a brow. "I'm staying," Selene clarified, meeting his gaze head on. "But if you think I'm going to sit quietly while you play alpha, you're mistaken." Cassian's eyes gleamed faintly, a hint of approval sparking behind them. "I wouldn't expect anything less," he replied. Selene exhaled, pressing her palms flat against the table. The weight of the bond thrummed beneath her skin, an ever-present reminder that things were far from simple, but simple was overrated anyway.